Welcome to Elite Team Talks, the podcast that simplifies the universal principles underpinning the world's most successful teams. I'm Henry Cheetham, founder of Elite Human Solutions. Join me as we venture into the minds of individuals who have created, led, researched, or been a part of history's most successful teams, from World Cup winning coaches to Special Forces leaders and the minds of Google. We're committed to presenting the most diverse array of thought leaders ever assembled. Through the stories and wisdom of our guests, we filter the noise, extract key insights, and deliver clear, actionable steps for you to build industry-leading teams and culture within your organisation. Welcome to Elite Team Talks. Hi everyone, and welcome. Today, our very first guest is Dr. Scott Draw. Over the last 20 years, Scott has led human performance departments across some of the most elite organisations in the world. He was head of research and innovation for Team GB over 5 Olympic cycles, led England Rugby's player development pathway, headed up Team Sky's performance hub, with my favourite job title, Imagineer, in the Tour de France, and now, as director of sport at Millfield, is building a team responsible for inspiring a generation at the leading sports school in the country. Over the last 2 decades, Scott's roles in research and innovation required him to look outside the traditional confines of sport, and much like this podcast, involved him bringing together some of the greatest thinkers across sport, science, business and the arts to discover new breakthroughs and explore human potential from different perspectives. He holds a PhD in sports science, has published 36 research papers, but most importantly, he manages to maintain the same childlike curiosity and energy for innovation and unlocking talent as he did 20 years ago. In today's episode, we discuss innovation and its precursors, curiosity and creativity. Scott explains his journey, the startup-like atmosphere when he joined Team Sky, and what he attributes his high level of curiosity to. We talk about how in the infinite game of business, where you can't actually win or lose, but simply get ahead or fall behind the competition, the goal is actually to out-innovate the competition. And Scott explains the 2 to 3 most crucial components for companies and teams to achieve this. You can expect to walk away understanding the essential components for innovation, how to do it better than your competition, how to reframe risk for next level innovation, and a sneak peek into the inner workings of British cycling's famous secret squirrel club. As always, if you enjoy the episode, please like, review, rate and subscribe the podcast. Most importantly, thank you as always for watching and listening. This podcast was created for you, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Cool. All right, so we're recording. So welcome, Scott. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Cool. Would you like to give the viewers a little bit of an understanding of who you are and your background?
So as you said, my name's Scott Draw. I'm currently Director of Sport at Millfield School. Millfield School is probably the UK's leading education environment for youth sport. I came here 5 years ago now, actually, after probably a career working in high performance. And that really started in the early 2000s when I was part of Team GB through UK Sport, really leading up research innovation for 13 years. And that was across 6 summer and winter Olympic and Paralympic sports, which is great. And that was a very fast-moving entrepreneurial time to be involved in sport, probably in that environment. I then went to work in international sport with England Rugby, which is a great experience. Very different insight in terms of a national governing body and structure, and really responsibility was across player development. And probably that's where I got my passion for talent development and a real understanding of that. I then got persuaded to go back and operate in a role with Team Sky and Sky, which was really came from the CEO of Sky at the time, a guy called Jeremy Darroch and Sir Dave Brailsford, who everyone's pretty familiar. And I knew Dave through my work in Olympic sport, came across to really, I guess, explore Sky making this big investment in professional cycling. How could they make more value of that? And it was really about connecting sport, education, art, creatives, business, all of those elements of it to find what what are the things that make most interest? Of course, when I was in that environment, I'd get called on a bit to sort of help the team because of my background. And in the end, I got completely immersed into that space. I came to here serendipity, really. Things played themselves out in life. I was getting drawn more and more into the team, but family circumstances were changing. Some were transitioning to school, and this opportunity came up, and I wasn't looking. And I sort of stepped into the unknown. And it's been a fascinating understanding experience of another part of the pathway and another part where sport plays a significant part of young people's lives, and particularly in the independent sector. So I guess really diverse range of experiences in sport, diverse range of sports, and always been more technically orientated. So scientist by trade, but involved in science, med tech, engineering. And that's still where my passion is, really. The opportunity to have autonomy, to explore, to change things, to try things, that type of environment's one that I personally feel I thrive in. And in Milford often provides that, but in a very different context.
Thank you. I mean, where do we start? There's obviously so many different experiences there and areas that we could delve into. You've held positions like head of research and innovation at UK Sport for 5 Olympic cycles, head of the Performance Hub. And I remember your job title, Imagineer, which still makes me smile, at Team Sky with Tour de France. And I knew you were someone that I'd have some interesting chats with. And now ultimately responsible for building a team for inspiring a generation at one of the highest performing schools in the country. You like innovation and discovery, don't you?
Yeah. And actually I had another recent podcast about, I was trying to understand where that come from, actually. And I wish I knew. There isn't a particular moment. But maybe it's just the nature that my brain never rests, and I like spinning lots of plates invariably. So, and I like new. And I think when the early stages of the development of the Olympic system, so before like what was the English Institute of Sport, now called UK Sports Institute, when before any of that existed, I came into an early role where there was a small central team there supporting Olympic sports. And it was like being in a startup is the best way of describing it. Huge amount of autonomy, huge opportunity with the resources just to go and explore. And, very young, I just finished my PhD. My real skills are in analytics, statistics, because my PhD was epidemiological based. And you're just immersed into this world that there were no constraints and no restrictions. So you sort of had to find and navigate your way through very uncertain territory. And that's where I'm really comfortable, in that grey space. I love uncertainty. I still remember going in my role when I went across the Sky and Team Sky, not having a job description, because you had to figure out what you needed to do. So those are the things that I'm really comfortable with. So it may be just natural curiosity and the natural desire to try things and understand. And that may be the sort of scientist in space. And I've been really fortunate to be in environments that allow me to do that. So when you're constantly testing your curiosity for real, in real life environments, you learn very, very quickly. And I guess and you get some successes and you get a number of things that don't work as well. I won't call them failures. They're lessons that you learn in that environment. So yeah, I don't know whether it's just, it came through my education environment, or where circumstances and environments ultimately provided me the opportunity to go and explore in that space. So yeah, I mean, I love the opportunity to do the new. I get bored with the standard stuff, because I'm constantly want to push forward and I'm very restless in that space. So it may be some personality characteristics that drive that. But I'm insatiably curious, absolute desire to understand and get to the crux of why things are like they are. And if not, can we do them much better?
Yeah, and it seems to be a commonality between those who innovate and those who challenge status quo to have that predeterminant. And I'm sure there'll be many listeners today wanting to understand how they can create that level of almost childlike curiosity. And I think it would be something that we could delve into later within the podcast. It'd be nice to discuss. But when was it that you first noticed you were more curious than others?
But I guess I wouldn't necessarily say I was more curious than others, because I think the environment that I came up through education, scientists, I think, are naturally curious in some senses, but it's probably more about where your level of risk taking will take you. So it's probably a willingness to genuinely want to really go into spaces that you don't understand. And with that comes a self-awareness around where your knowledge limitations are, and then your ability to work with others. So if you're crossing into fields that you're truly not an expert, you've got to be able, there's a skill to be able to connect with those individuals and then to extract information from them that helps the problems you're trying to solve. So there's a little bit about that. So it's probably, you talk about the environment you're in. I've been very fortunate to work with mentors or leaders who given that freedom to go and do things. So it's not just theoretical, it's real. And so I've been really fortunate when I think about that my desire to try to understand, my desire to want to do new and be around individuals that allow that to happen with some level of constraint and support, and has been the things that have enabled that to flourish. But I think the reality of performance sport, and particularly high performance at the end, I just think it's a fundamental to be able to move forward. And to be able to do that more at like when you're up in the helicopter, I think it's really easy to get caught up in what I call the inch wide, mile deep. So you may be a real specialist in one area, and for you, your curiosity is just taking you deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. My sense is that's not where you make the breakthroughs or genuinely challenge convention. I think it's your ability to come out of that very narrow channel and get above it and see, actually, there's another channel that's quite interconnected that may take me into a slightly different place. And I think that's one of the skills I've been able to do that. And you often see people that make those breakthroughs or really try to do different things are those that can get up into the helicopter, and you're genuinely able to feel comfortable operating in a space of uncertainty.
No, it's fascinating, and it resonates with that phrase that we've probably all heard: you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. And being able to have the diverse perspectives within a team, but also the empathy, I guess, within yourself to reframe what that problem is, and from that to be able to generate those innovative solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to think of examples. There's a great story. I was really fortunate in my early years to be part of a project team that became known as the Secret Squirrel Club. It stemmed out of British Cycling at the time. I still remember Chris Boardman, an amazing legend and hero in terms of British sport. He was sort of sharing a story at the time. We were doing lots of aerodynamic testing on race suits and various aspects of it. And he recalled this story where he was sat in bed with his wife and he's discussing the work that's going on. And his wife, she's super smart in any sense, was just asking questions about whether they'd ever tested these race suits when they were wet. And you're sat there thinking through, yeah, we missed a bloody obvious thing, haven't we? So everyone's sweating when they often go and race after a big warm-up. And we've been doing all this testing and understanding around fabrics, and we haven't done them. We're under them. Now, that seems a simple thing, isn't it? But you've got a non-expert, if the way I describe it is listening to some stories being told, and there's a very different perspective and lens on it, and has suddenly asked a question, a very curious question, well, why have you never done that? And you're like, actually, I don't know why we haven't. And that led us down some particular pathways to explore fabrics, textiles, aerodynamic performance, and very different constraints as well. So, it didn't give us a breakthrough moment, but what it did is open a door. And it was then about us pursuing that door, and it led us down a different pathway, and some different gains in different directions. So there's really, I think, there's a guy called Scott Barry Kaufman, he studies giftedness, is the way he's quoted. He's an American psychologist. He studied curiosity and creativity, and one of the biggest determinants of somebody's ability to be creative is their I guess they call it open-mindedness, but it's the ability to engage in other spaces. There's some great research that shows, if you look at some of the top scientists in the world, what you typically would see is people that are got Royal Fellows, for example, in the Royal Society, will typically have more hobbies and avocations than anybody else. So they go to spaces and do other things out their normal space. And so they're suddenly connecting these dots in different worlds. And they basically got more experiences that they can call on when they're faced with new challenges and problems and opportunities. And so that's it. You've got to create these environments and opportunities with that. and realize you don't have all the answers. You know, you look at the amount of stuff and new information now that's available. You cannot know it. So your ability to create a network of different experiences to go to different places means you have a lot more to call on. And then it's your job about putting those jigsaws together. So that sort of the one I just shared about Chris is just an example of, you've got to allow other people in your space who will view things from a different perspective, and they'll ask questions. So you've got to be comfortable with being able to listen to that and think, no, that's not a silly question. That's got real validity. And then it's about having these connections and networks and frameworks and experiences that you can call. Basically, you need the toolbox that's so bloody big and wide and diverse, it can take you to spaces. So I think those are some of the characteristics of things that enable you to be creative and innovative. And creative and innovation slightly different. That's another matter in its sense. But I think that was one of the things that I immersed myself in. You know, certainly those early years in Olympic space, I just spent a lot of time going to different universities, different organizations, learning different things. And suddenly a challenge or opportunity arises, and you're able to connect the dots. You know, I guess in my early career, I was probably more like a conductor of an orchestra, is the best way of describing it. Your orchestra was this team of experts from many different spaces. It could be military, it could be aerospace, it could be sports science, it could be physiology, it could be like people in a room. That's your orchestra, and your audience is the sport saying, we've observed all these things, we don't quite know what to do. And our job was to try to build that orchestra to help test that idea that they'd seen or help answer questions they posed. And that's the way it sort of evolved. So there's lots in that conversation that we've sort of had. But I think the essence of it is, we talk about being open-minded, but be curious, bring people into your environment who may not understand it. I've got lots of examples where that was hugely beneficial. But expose yourself to as many different experiences as you can outside of your normal sphere of interest, because you never know what that may lead to. And I think those are some of the critical ingredients I'd always encourage anyone who wants to develop themselves as an individual.
Brilliant. The two key things that I've taken away from that is diversity of thought and experience, and creating a culture with psychological safety to challenge perspectives and ways of thinking. And it sounds like the environments you've worked in had both of those things in abundance. So it's natural, isn't it, that you're going to innovate and be creative from those?
Yeah, maybe I naturally found those spaces in some ways as well. I don't know, but certainly in the early stages of my life and career in Olympic sport, because it wasn't a startup mentality, you know, and things were still emerging, it was that speedboat is the way I describe it, as opposed to being a super tanker. Like once a sporting system or NGB gets so big, there's so many layers to decision making because of compliance, because of regulation, because of all of those things. Whenever ever in any organization, it's how can you retain that speedboat mentality that enables you to go and explore and be entrepreneurial, but within the framework that you're operating within. And so I think that is critical. And of course, the whole startup sector's emerged massively in the past 10, 15 years as well. So you tend to be seeing a lot of that in that space. But the best way of sort of describing it, saying maybe I naturally went to those environments. The time with Team Sky and Ineos was exactly the same. The staff in that environment were constantly knew they had to progress and had to move forward. And so it was an inherent characteristic of that environment. It was expected of you to try to constantly move things forward. And it was always about the pace of change that you could go.
Yeah, it sounds definitely like you found your sweet spot. And it's a colleague of mine previously, James King, who nicely sums that up. But he says, the sweet spot is where your interests, values, and skills intersect. And when you're in it, the sky is the limit. And from what it sounds like, you had those three things within those environments that you were.
Yeah, and equally when you're not in it, it does in environments like that. And I'd probably describe my time at England Rugby was a bit like that. And equally being in an education environment, it helps you value what those are. But one of the big things about innovation in general is when you put constraints in, you have to think differently how to do things. So you appreciate what you had, but then also when you put a constraint in it, you have to operate in a very different way. or those were probably much more open. If I look at my Olympic time and time in Team Sky, much more open in autonomous, and my time in independent education versus England rugby, not as much. They were still innovative in their own way, because they were less resources, more resourceful was a great thing. So when you put a constraint in because of some of those systems, you've got to operate a very different way. But I still think one of the most critical factors around all of that space is about your speed and rate of operation once you're there. So there is a great quote from a guy called Arius de Use. I call on it a lot. He was part of a big petrochemical company. He says the only sustainable competitive advantage you can maintain is to learn faster than the opposition. So you've got to create those opportunities where if you have an idea, you can test it and learn from it quite quickly. And so there's a systematic nature to that. So it's a lot about that rate of learning, I think, is really important in those environments.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of a mental model that I've heard of called the Red Queen effect. I don't know if you've come across it before.
Oh, explain.
It's taken actually from Alice in Wonderland, believe it or not, where in essence the Red Queen explains how the faster everyone else is running, the faster you have to run just to stay in the same place. Right. But there's obviously a limit to how fast teams and companies can run and how long they can run at maximum pace for. And really, the only way of running faster is to become more efficient through innovation. And you could use the analogy of running itself and innovation having brought us the bicycle, the car, airplanes, etc. But for a lot of companies and teams, the level of competition and the level of innovation now, with globalization, with access to really diverse frameworks and perspectives, is at a whole nother level, before you even bring in technology and AI. And we've all heard the quote, it's not the strongest or most intelligent that survives, but the most adaptable to change. I guess, how could you identify whether you're doing this well, whether you are learning as quickly as possible? Do you have to wait to see whether you get ahead or fall behind, or are there key indicators that you can track and test?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's a really good question. I'm going to think it through. I've been really fortunate. So even in my time here, I still get involved in various projects in the high performance space. And there's some things that have often resonated with me around, because some sports, some organizations are more highly resourced, money often doesn't become a rate limiting step for them. I think that the challenge that means is they end up getting drawn into a rabbit hole. Does that make sense? So they just end up deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the same problem or same challenge they're trying to solve, the same opportunity. So where am I going to? So if I went into an organization to observe around practice, get an idea of what challenges they're trying to solve and how they're going about it, a lot about their process of innovation, if I call it that, and the environment will tell me a huge amount about them. There's a sort of checklist of stuff, as simple as it is, of behaviors, of leadership styles, of way budgets are resourced, like about just the pace and energy in a space that would tell you a little bit about an environment without making it overly complicated. And you would, in a simple perspective, be able to see that, because it's just documented well enough. Like as soon as you understand how that works and how that or doesn't work, it tells you everything about an environment. So just because I've been really fortunate to be in so many spaces, I've got this sort of checklist I could go in that will tell me a huge amount about it. So yeah, and you just look at them. It will tell you relatively quickly by just being, they call the research process appreciative inquiry, just observing an ethnographer. If I went into an environment like that, it would tell me a huge amount about it. If there's anything I've observed in the past 10 years is those organizations that are super well resourced are often not the most innovative. They just ended up going down this rabbit hole. Their ability to get out of it and look big picture, just to see whether the emerging opportunities are and then go for them, just like that type of thinking isn't there. So it just, yeah, I've never thought of it that way, but I have got these checklists that I would go in, and I sort of, in presentations I give, I can sort of describe some of the characteristics of innovative environments, and ultimately you'll just see it in the product, because it's that type of thinking, and you'll see it in the way people share their stories about projects they're involved in, about what they're learning. There's a real energy and buzz around the place, really. So I haven't characterized it officially, but I could do. And there's to say, there's a checklist of things around the leadership style, the autonomy people would have, around the types of projects that they're involved in, whether it's in their area of discipline or not. It's about the external people they engage with in their environment. Like there's a list of things, and you could scale it from nothing to massive, and you could end up with a little ranking in some ways around what you believe would characterize that type of space. So I haven't answered your question particularly, but there's no one thing, of course, but it starts from the top around the leadership environment, the follower type leader model in some respects, and then just the other people, the spaces they go to, the experiences that their staff would have. Like, there's so much in it that you'd get a really good feel of some of those characteristics.
And for the viewers and listeners who maybe don't have your background across a really diverse range of fields and a deep understanding of how to identify innovation done well and not, just to put you on the spot, what one or two or three potentially of that list, or things on that list, would you say would be the first things that you'd look at, whether it's leadership, whether it's processes?
Yeah, I mean, if I just focus on an individual, I would look at their curiosity. And by that, I could go into somebody, if they're are not on social media, it doesn't have to be that, but it's one format of where there's available information. Are they on it? And let's look at their followers. So really simply, you can go in and characterize the breadth and depth of the type of people that they follow. So that would be one way of just assessing somebody's breadth of experiences and knowledge and insight. If you're a physiologist and all the people you follow are physiologists, I'd be thinking, I'm not so sure about that. So that would be one thing. And that's just an example of one way that you could assess it in some senses. I'd want to know about their experiences. I want to know where they've been in the past 5 years, who they've met, what events, like just what's the breadth that they have as opposed to depth. There's always a little bit of depth to it. The second thing is I want to know what they've actually done. So let's assume you're curious. It's then your willingness to go and experiment. I want to see your portfolio. Describe to me the ideas you've had from your curiosity and the ones that you've managed to test and take forward. That doesn't necessarily mean running a scientific experiment, but have you tried things, got some feedback? So there's a little bit of that. And then I guess the third element of that will be about the reflection and coaching element of it. So you've done all that. Have you shared your story? Have you taken any of the feedback from it? And where's it led? So what path has it taken you? So I think those are the three things probably that I could look, and you could measure it if you wanted to. But that's a start point for you.
That's brilliant. And for maybe companies or teams who already have an established lineup, they have people in there already, and they're ultimately just looking to, say, enhance their processes or leadership approach to innovate better, applying the same 2 or 3 principles or key performance indicators to that, what would you say those were?
So at an organizational level, I guess the level of risk taken in an organization is inherently important. But I think knowing that the leadership model is more leader, if that makes sense. So individuals have the autonomy in their roles, whether that's actually written into a job description or they genuinely have the opportunity to do new things and go new places, and all those things will be a critical. And so there's a decision making from the top that we support that, and everyone is an innovator in some senses. Because other organizations may, and certainly in my time, have a separate function that's called research innovation. And there's that balance point around, is it one or the other? I think you need a bit of both. That's a reality. But I worked in a team whose sole job was to do research innovation. And we're working with individuals in sport who are just very operational. So if you're with a coach who's, and an athlete who are just doing the day-to-day job, when will they genuinely get time to do that? I mean, they're probably innovating every day the way they coach. But if they have a much bigger question, they may need to work with others to do it. So there's great an idea of mentality about how you frame your workforce, the autonomy they have, all those elements of it, that's important. It's then whether you back it with resources, but also whether you then create an environment where sharing those stories is an acceptable part of how you function and operate. So you celebrate, I won't call them failures, but you celebrate the experiments you've been on and what you learn from it as much as possible. And there's some brilliant management research that shows that's a really good predictor of future performance. There's a great analogy. I forget who this is, so I can't reference them, but I heard from somebody, fail is your first attempt in learning. So really your willingness to push open to those doors and what you reflect from it. So I think you can do that at an organizational level as well as individual level. So it's similar, but it just looks different when you look at it from an organizational perspective. And as you say, I think the key bit around that is how do you frame a research innovation function? Is it part of everyone's job or is it separate? A lot depends on the maturity of the organization, for sure, the system that you have. But I think you need a bit of both depending on what you're trying to do.
Brilliant. And moving on to the 5 Olympic Games that you had with Team GP, a lot of people listening to this will work in the corporate sector, and ultimately they're playing an infinite game. There isn't an Olympics every 4 years where they decide whether they were successful, whether they won or they lost. So if you can't win or lose and you can only fall or get behind, what could anyone listening today learn from the work you did in continually evolving and innovating Team GB over those 5 Olympic Games? And what were the 2 biggest learnings you took away from it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're right in that, Olympic Games, the date doesn't move. And if you've got a particular event on a particular day, it's sort of set. So that helps. That frames the problem really, really well. And if you then map out an Olympic period, the way I sort of think about it, when you come out of the Olympic period, the year after the Games is pretty much a down year. There's often staff changes and lots of those elements of it. And, major world champs are not so meaningful in that sense. And yes, you need to perform, and it's a great opportunity for young athletes to get exposure to all of those things. But if you're to quantify, probably, that when you're in competition time, it's really hard to take on new things. Just the focus is logistics and delivery and all those things. But if you're to quantify the time you have to be innovative, if I call it that, it's really at most about 18 months. Because pre-Olympic year, you're bedding things down. You're in Olympic qualifications. You don't want to be changing too much. So if you assume for every year you're 6 months competing, a competing cycle, and 6 months you get a chance of training, that's where you can really move things on. If you had to quantify that, you got this 12, 18-month window. So I guess one of the key lessons from all of that is I do think you need to, one of the constraints is time, the other is money. I think you need to use the principle of constraints to help people be innovative. And there's a brilliant video about, I'm just trying to think of the guy, Dave Snowden. He does a lot around chaos and systems thinking. He talks around a mission in NASA, which is to do with the Tom Hanks movie. It's a brilliant video. He just talks about this things, it's going to get to a point where everyone's going to die, and you've got all the engineers back in NASA just saying, what's in the spaceship? We've got all these things to try and solve the problem. So what's happened there are some constraints around pressure, time. There's a significant impact in terms of what's happening. So if you look at those environments where there are constraints, it tells you a little bit around that. So I think if you want to not force it, you need to create environments where there are some constraints that'll challenge people's thinking to move on. So in an Olympic space, it is time. You just got to do it, and you got to deliver something. So often you're looking for the perfect solution. The reality is never perfect. You keep pushing until a point where you got to ease off and just deliver it. So I think that would be one of the key things around all of that. You have to constrain things, which often can force people to make decisions and move forward. So that would definitely be a big lesson. And so lots of examples of how that works. The second big lesson for everybody, and probably those experiencing the Olympics, I guess I learned a huge amount around, I will call it the psychology of diversion and deception. What happens when you are pushing forward and the opposition becomes very noticeable? So we were fortunate, rules and regs have changed now to be able to drop new things at a major Olympic Games, and it would get noticed. And actually, when you sort of think back and reflect on that, your ability to do that pissed a lot of people off. But it also meant they weren't focused on their own job. They're looking at you. What are you doing? Why have they done that? Why they like all of that stuff? So I guess the second one to take people on, I think you've got to know what good looks like. And often the reflection that I had in that time, good would look like when people hated you in some senses. Like there would always something, people would be focusing on you. You would be changing the narrative and language about in that sport. And that's a really good indicator that you're there. Does that make sense? Like you are, there's so much in history. There's so many examples in the past where that's happened. You know, if I look at Eliud Kipchoge's 2-hour record, everyone's talking about the shoes, like not about the other stuff that went on. So it creates these stories where people are focusing on you and not on themselves. And in some ways, that's a good marker and indicator that you're on the edges and you're pushing ahead of other people.
Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So it makes total sense. Cool. Let's take a break for 5 minutes or so, and we'll pick up after discussing your time with Team Sky in the Tour de France and Millfield, if you're happy with that.
So I think you'll agree there's some pretty brilliant takeaways from today's episode with Scott. It was a fascinating chat. I myself learnt a huge amount from chatting with him, and hopefully you had some nice insights too. So in regards to what we actually talked about, what I like to do is compare it back to what I call the 5P framework: purpose, people, problem, process, and proof, just to create more clarity around the themes that we're discussing and the clear action points that you can take away. So the top key 3 themes that I saw was around innovative people, innovative processes, and innovative proof. So from an innovative people standpoint, well, why is this important? The research shows actually diverse teams are nearly twice as innovative. And in essence, what we were discussing and what Scott was explaining was that on an individual level, hiring people with experience and curiosity across a diverse range of topics, people with the courage to lean into risk, and people with the desire to be collaborative was really crucial. On a team and company level, Scott explained that diversity of thought and experience, both from within and from bringing people outside the organisation in, was really crucial. From a process standpoint, it's really important that we take a process that allows us to be innovative. 3 things that Scott mentioned were a shared leader-leader style of leadership, creating psychological safety and therefore the freedom to explore, lean into risk and embrace uncertainty within teams and the organisation. And then also applying constraints. As we know from the research, constraints-led approaches to innovation actually supercharge innovation by limiting resources and requiring people to get more creative with these problems and solutions. So the third theme, innovative proof, we discussed why proactively identifying what innovation looks like for your people, teams and organizations is really crucial, and then actually measuring this longitudinally. And why is this important? Well, the research shows that companies which focus on stakeholders, such as your people, from them and what they need, rather than shareholders, actually grow twice as quick. So the action points that I took away from this were: number 1, hire people with diverse experiences and test for curiosity, courage, and a desire to collaborate in your screening process. Number 2, communicate constraints and then provide your teams with the autonomy and freedom to explore, take risks, and actually celebrate learning from failure. And number 3, create a universal understanding of what innovation looks like and build this into daily communication, into performance strategies, and performance reviews. So hopefully that summarized what we spoke about. Really encourage you to apply any insights that you have today in your own settings, to take on these action points, discuss them with your peers, and see whether you can create a more innovative company. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with others. In the next episode, Scott and I will discuss the similarities between high-pressure boardrooms and preparing for the Tour de France, with Scott explaining what he believes to be the essential components for teams to not just survive, but actually thrive under pressure. Scott breaks down the misconceptions around the phrase marginal gains and instead explains how Their focus was on having an extremely in-depth understanding of what it takes to win, alongside a highly adaptable plan, as no plan survives first contact. He also speaks about what it takes to repeatedly perform at the highest level, and how it's both you, the individual's responsibility, and the organisation's to own this. To finish off, Scott explains what we as adults could learn from children and how to rediscover your innate curiosity within. You can expect to walk away from the next episode with an understanding of how to adapt and evolve quicker than the competition, what it was actually like preparing for the highest pressure race in the world, how to create a deep sense of connection in your company, and how to repeatedly perform at your best, both for you and your team. Thank you as always to you, our viewers and listeners, for watching today's episodes and for your support. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you very soon.